Thank you for having me, everyone. So I was asked here today just to give you a bit of a chat about the Granny Skills movement and how this journey has I guess, taken me to the Granny Skills movement. So my name is Rebecca Sullivan. I'm from Malala, so mid-north South Australia. I'm a good country girl. I grew up in the wheat belt of South Australia. Does anyone know where Malala is? Oh, look, a few people. Wow, that's fantastic. That doesn't happen very often. So my parents took us to Malala when I was about 9 years old. I went kicking and screaming, going, I don't want to live in the country. It's not really that country, but you know, it was country enough. And when I got to about 16, I sort of went, oh my gosh, the only thing that really interests me in this country town is the farmers, the young farmers, the ones that were going to be the young farmers. And that was about it. I was in a town that was, you know, covered in dust and wheat and stuff, and I didn't really get it. We weren't farmers. My family weren't farmers. I was like, what are we doing here? So I, like all good teenagers, ran away and lived in New York for a year. And I did my year 12 there, and I lived the American dream and was a cheerleader and all of those things. And after my year, got dragged back to Australia kicking and screaming, and found myself back in Malala, still going, don't understand the wheat. Yep, the farmers have grown up, they're a bit handsome, but still didn't quite get it. So I went and studied journalism, and then I ran off again to London, and I ended up spending the next 10 years in London. And my first real job in London was actually working in professional cycling. I was the communications director for the Tour of Britain, which is a little bit like the Tour de France, but the British version. And I spent the next 3 years very luckily travelling the world with one of the pro teams and doing all the press and communications for this team and having a wonderful time. But it turned out I was spending way less time actually on the race and doing my job on the race, and I found most of the time I was more curious about what my boys were eating and who was cooking it for them. And we spent a lot of time in Italy, and I eventually found that I could creep into the kitchen, and it was always the nonna that was cooking for us. There was always a nonna that was, you know, the mother of the person who owned the hotel, and she happened to be the one that was the cook, and what a fabulous cook. No matter where I went in Italy, I just found the same thing over and over again. It was always the nonna, and she could always just pull these magnificent meals out of nowhere from sort of 3 or 4 ingredients. And so that got me thinking. I was like, oh, this is curious. I like this food thing. I was always an eater. My nan was always a feeder. And so I went, you know, I really want to work in food, and I didn't know how to work in food or where I would fit in food. But it turned out that these nonna and a lot of the people that I kept bumping into were part of something called the slow food movement. Does anyone know the slow food movement? Okay, wonderful, that's pretty much everyone. So I joined the slow food movement in London, and I was made the youth ambassador for Slow Food UK, which meant basically that I was able to go out there and just campaign for slow food type business, which was food and policy. And then from there I launched a Real Food Festival, which was a big festival in London, in Earl's Court, and it was about 40,000 people over a weekend, and we were talking about sustainability and food and skills and how important agriculture was. And it started to dawn on me that actually, you know, I was running away from this big sort of country game, the wheat and the tractors, and I sort of had started to come a bit full circle and was understanding agriculture. And from there I went and studied sustainable agriculture. I did a master's at the Royal Agricultural College, and then went to Berkeley University and did environmental leadership. And all the while I found that all of these people that kept coming into my lives that I was learning the most from were the elders. So they were the grannies and the grandpas. So don't be offended, grandpas, I'll get to that bit, that did come into play. And I kept working in food, and you know, I started food writing, and I started working directly with small producers, and then I found something called the Women's Institute, which is effectively the Country Women's Association, but in the UK. And so I thought, well, I want to get involved in this. I was moving back to London, so I decided to set up my own branch. And it was there that I started to learn about jam and how to make jam. But it turns out I could never quite get my jam to set. And I remember just thinking that these women were the ones that had kind of mastered it. They'd been practicing for a long time, and they were the ones winning all the Royal Show medals. And I went, okay, there's something in this, and things started triggering, and I started spending more and more time with elder women and learning their skills. And I found that I'd been collecting all of the old recipes and didn't still quite know what it was. And then the light bulb moment. So my great grandmother, her name was Lil. She was 4'11" and the ballsiest woman I'd ever met in my life. She was absolutely, without a doubt, my role model. She was amazing, the head of our family, just wonderful, wonderful. And in 2008, she passed away. And she, for sure, she had a fabulous innings. She was 100, she was amazing. But my mum gave me some of her things in a box. I was still living in London at the time. And in the box were a stack of certificates and medals. And it turns out these medals were for something called the Women's Own Cookery Competitions. So they were a little bit like Women's Day or Women's Weekly in the UK. And it turns out my great-grandmother Lil was an award-winning baker. So she had won 40, 50 plus medals for her Victoria sponge. And in an instant, my heart just broke into a million little pieces, because here I was, working in food, working in and around these sort of areas, working with amazing people, and I had never once seen my grandma Lil bake. I had never once seen her cook, and I had never once asked her about food. I'd never asked her about what she ate growing up. I'd never asked her about, her experiences with it, because you just sometimes don't. And so my nan was always the feeder in our family, and I always saw my nan cooking, but I never asked my great-grandmother how to make her Victoria sponge. And it just sort of struck a chord with me that I can't be the only person in the world that has that regret the instant that their elders are gone. The instant that they're gone and they haven't asked them those questions. They haven't kept that old recipe book. All those old scribbled down recipes that you go, and you put them in a drawer somewhere, and you go, I'll get to it later, and you promised yourself that you're going to scrapbook them all or type them up and keep them, but in the end they just go off to the op shop or whatever, or they get thrown in the bin, and then you regret it 10 years later. So I knew in that instant that I wasn't the only person that had that regretful relationship around not asking the questions and not spending the time. So I thought, okay, how can we make this a call to action? How can we make this something that people don't regret? So that's where the Granny Skills movement came. I moved back to Australia 4 years ago, and I had this idea of this Granny Skills movement. I didn't know what it looked like, but I knew that it was something. And I knew that it was something that was emotionally driven, because every time I went on, I wrote my book first, which is called Like Grandma Used to Make, which is a collection of recipes, not just from my grandmothers, but from all grandmothers that I mentioned earlier that I'd been collecting. And so I started doing a lot of radio interviews, and every time people would call up, they would say the same thing to me. They would say, I wish I got that recipe for that Cornish pasty. And you'd hear the joy in people's voices when they'd talk about, that apricot jam that my nan used to make, and the smells and the nostalgia. It brings out pure joy in people that can't be recreated. And so this movement idea came from, how do we not allow that to happen? So to me, our grandmothers do what is now kind of trendy, right? They ate locally, they ate seasonally, they didn't waste their food, nothing went in the bin. I don't know about you, but if I go to my nan's house, she'd go, I don't have any food, sorry. Next minute, feast fit for a king, just from the leftovers and the things that are in her cupboard. And she didn't buy food from strangers really, because it didn't really exist. Now by default, this is what we're being forced to do, because we've kind of taken it too far. So as somebody who has worked in sustainability and has done a master's in and around, and I'm doing a PhD at the moment studying all this stuff, for me the easiest way to be sustainable is to live a little bit more like our grannies, especially when it comes to the wasting food thing and being frugal and being economic. So I thought, how can I make this Granny Skills movement active? So we decided to trial Granny Skills in schools. And what we did last year is in Victoria we had 6 schools, and here in South Australia we had 1 school. And we trialled this program where we took grannies, or people with granny skills, into schools, and they passed on basic home economics skills. So they would go in and they would teach the kids how to use their leftovers, how to pickle and preserve their food, how to knit and crochet, how to sew on a button, all of those things that you would think would be a granny skill, so to speak. And then we thought, okay, how do we include the grandpas in this? And for me, granny skills, my granny was always the kitchen and the craft, and my grandpa was always the garden and the shed. So we decided to start the Grandpa Skills movement that was all about protecting those skills. So it evolved into this trial that ended up being directly working with aged care facilities, and we found that the mental health benefits that came from having these women and men go into schools was far beyond what any prescribed medicine could have done. We found that we did a 10-week program, and not a single person in the aged care facility that was part of the program spoke of their ailments for the entire program, because their sense of place and their knowledge and all of those things that you can only imagine, all of those things, they just felt valued and part of community, and it was amazing. And so, like all great things that are an amazing idea, they require people, and I now have a database of all of these people with these granny skills that want to use them, but no money. So I've been funding it all myself, and I've been going on my merry way, continuing to work to try and pay the bills, but the Granny Skills movement has sort of sat there, and the Grandpa Skills has sat there, and we finally just partnered up with the Philip Kennedy Centre in Lards Bay. They have 180 residents, and we're starting Granny Skills and Grandpa Skills clubs next year in January. Not only are we bringing perfect, thank you. We're bringing a school, a local school Year 5 class in once a month to have their classes in the aged care facility. We're starting our knitting clubs and our garden clubs and our men's sheds club, and we're basically opening the aged care facility up to the general public to come in and spend time with these elderly people. Also, to add to that, we're launching, my partner's Aboriginal, and there's no one in the world I know more than has regret around not knowing anything about his elders. And so we are launching our Indigenous wellbeing brand in January, called Wandu, which in Damien's language means feel good, and that is effectively a mission to regenerate community, culture, tradition, health and soil. And when I say soil, because of my expertise in sustainability and agriculture, we are trying to create a brand in which we're integrating native foods back into not just Indigenous people's diets, but everyone's diets, because these ingredients were supposed to be here and we're supposed to be eating them. And so that's another project, but it is come from this whole idea around protecting elders' knowledge, skills, heritage and traditions. There's a much bigger scope to this, but that's basically Granny Skills in a very, very short period. If anyone is keen to get involved, we need armies of people. My email address is rebecca@dirtygirlkitchen.com if anyone's keen. We have a community of about 5,000 on Facebook, and it is currently Dirty Girl Kitchen. That's not Dirty Girl's Kitchen, that's another brand that you don't want to look at. And Dirty Girl Kitchen is an amazing community where Granny Skills live, and we're just in the process of changing the name back over to Granny Skills. Please get in touch if you're interested. This is something that's so important for everyone, especially as my grandmother's now 81. I certainly have no intention of having that regretful relationship with her, and I spend every waking hour writing down her recipes. I have my books. If anyone is interested in a copy, we're doing a special today for everyone at the Mini Maker Fair, so I'll be outside for the next 10 minutes. But thank you for listening, because the more people that know about this movement and what's going on, the greater effect it will have on positive ageing. And you know, I just want to see the elderly people in our community have a really positive elder part of their life, and that's only going to happen if we make that happen. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and yeah, thank you very much. Cheers.